We're still in the business of shaping policy, and that's why we want to look at efforts being made by world leaders to address the issue of security on the global scene, which was part of what necessitated the conference, the Munich Security Conference, that took place over the weekend in Germany. World leaders gathered together to look at issues related to security. The issues related to Ukraine-Russia war was part of the highlights. These are things we're going to discuss, and our special guest analyst is ready for us. We're being joined by Kadir Adamu, who is the MD, Beacon Security and Intelligence Limited. Glad you have joined us, Mr. Adamu, on Early Exchange this morning. It's been a while.
My pleasure. Good morning.
All right. Now, let's start our conversation by making reference to the Munich Security Conference that happened in Germany over the weekend. Several world leaders came together to talk about the issues of security globally. Parts of the highlight has to be the ongoing war in Ukraine, where Russia has taken a position that is still going ahead with the war, irrespective of the appeal from the world leaders. Talk to us, how much of challenge has this posed to the effort to secure security globally and to promote unity among nations?
All right, thank you very much. The Munich Security Conference is an annual gathering of world leaders where they attempt to x-ray developments, both political, economic, and sometimes environmental, as well as cyber, that are impacting security around the world. So this year, as is traditional, they highlighted several challenges, one of which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the fact that 2 years into that issue, unfortunately, there isn't an end in sight to that invasion. And I think the challenge for a continent like Europe is what would follow through if Russia is successful in its domination of Ukraine. Other European countries may also be targeted in the same manner that Ukraine was targeted. And so for that reason, this issue was quite prominent. What are the likely consequences of this issue? Number one, the global, I would say, warfare, sometimes proxy, between the Western countries and Russia is expanding. It's expanding into new areas, including Africa. Even in our neighborhood in Nigeria, we're seeing that where probably we'll speak about that later. After the coup in Niger, we've seen an attempt by the Nigerian junta to move closer to Russia. Now, the Western powers, US, Europe, are uncomfortable about that, and they are also trying to put forward their own ways to stop that. We're seeing the same thing in Central African Republic. We're also seeing it in places like Mali, where already Russia is embedded within the security and protection system in that country. So that this rivalry, as it were, global rivalry, which essentially is a competition for economic resources, is likely to intensify as the warfare between Russia and the West continues in Ukraine. One major challenge of recent has been the entrance of Trump into the debate and the likelihood that he could run and win the American elections. He has stated clearly his position on NATO and how NATO members who are not contributing financially to NATO may not be protected by the US and NATO, as it were. And there is an interpretation that that is going to strengthen Russia. And so if that happens, as an example, Europe is asking itself, where is it positioned if Trump emerges as the winner? So all of these are some of the conversations that occurred. Of course, I mentioned the economic reason behind the competition between Russia and these Western countries. Yeah.
All right. At the conference also, there was the talk about the lose-lose scenario, which is the concentration of the word on competition rather than cooperation. Now, what can happen to ensure cooperation, and what could be the gains of cooperation instead of competition? Is it even possible to achieve cooperation at this time globally?
I think the most important thing is for the Western countries themselves to speak the three languages that they've been trying to promote within the pretext of democracy, and that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Global South, at the moment, does not feel fairly treated. Most decisions are taken by the North, as it were, and imposed on the Global South. And so it's very difficult to promote a win-win situation where there's a perception that those who decide not necessarily have the interest of those upon which their decisions have an impact upon. And a good example is the United Nations. Till date, the UN Security Council is dominated by this country. There is no diversity, equity, and inclusion in the structuring of the UN Security Council. When the BRICS countries decided to take a step and promote their own interest, we've seen how attempts have been made to strangulate them. So unless we promote equity, diversity, and inclusion, and unless the global multilateral platforms that exist at the moment are divided and diverse in terms of their membership and in terms of appreciating the peculiar challenges of the Global South, then it's going to be a little bit difficult, really, for a win-win situation to emerge. Countries will continue to seek and promote their interest, and where those interests are not in tangent with what the Global North is promoting, then it will be very difficult, really, to have a win-win situation.
All right, now let's focus on the essence of this conference. If you can hear me, Adam. All right. Now let's focus on the essence of this platform is to create a kind of platform for world leaders to address the global security issues. The one that happened this year is the 60th anniversary. Now, taking a clue from what actually brought about the Munich kind of agreement in the first place and the history behind it, would you say that the world leaders have been able to take advantage of this platform to promote security and facilitate unity globally? What are some of the shortcomings you've observed about this platform, especially when some people talked about issues related to Africa not being part of the agenda for this kind of conference? How will you react to that?
Well, just like I mentioned earlier on, you cannot speak for someone when you've not given him the voice to speak for himself or herself. The perception, and I think this is the general view from most of the South, is that conferences like the Munich conference are there to promote the Northern agenda. Issues that are of interest to them are issues that are promoted, and very rarely do you hear the voice of the South at such conferences. So as an example, when the Sahelian issue was brought up, the genesis and the reasons for the Sahelian issues have not been discussed. And what are those genesis? The huge socioeconomic challenges, the lack of skill retention. In Nigeria at the moment, our major challenge as far as the youth bulge is concerned is the Japa syndrome. And it was never discussed at a conference like that, the migration of skills from the South to the North. Instead, what we're seeing is a promotion of that migration, actually. And so as long as these platforms, multilateral platforms like the Munich conference, do not pursue in reality, act in the manner of what they are promoting, in other words, provide platforms for all voices to be heard, and then to ensure that when those voices are heard, action is also taken to promote what those voices are saying. Then, unfortunately, this current situation that they've described as lose-lose will continue. And I think that's what we saw in the just concluded conference.
All right. One of the issues, too, that was discussed is the role of multilateral institutions and how they can strengthen the role of these multilateral institutions in ensuring global order and development. What's your take on that?
Yes, if we look back into history, and of course, even the creation of the United Nations, it was to promote and provide platforms that would help avoid what existed before the creation of such bodies. For instance, the First and Second World War. And if there is any card that one can wave and say it is a success for the UN as a multilateral body, is the fact that we've not seen a third world war. But is the world order one that is we're happy about at the moment? No. Events that have unfolded in Ukraine when Russia invaded Ukraine, events that are unfolding at the moment in Gaza, and then even in the Sahel region, where certain military officials have decided to truncate democracy and all of that. These are issues that I would say multilateral bodies at the moment have not been able to address. The global pandemic that followed COVID and the consequences of that. And then, of course, the climate change issues. These are real issues that, unfortunately, the current multilateral system are unable to address. Have they helped in reducing the consequence of this? Yes, they are. So point I'm making is there are progresses, there are successes, but there are also room for improvement. One of the arguments that have emerged of recent is the role, private bodies or non-governmental organizations are playing, and in an attempt to fill the gaps that exist as a result of the failures of these multilateral bodies. And so these are things that need to be taken into consideration, where, for instance, like I've spoken about earlier on, there is a need to look inwards and ensure there is equity in representation in these multilateral bodies, so that every part of the world, every segment of the society feels carried along. And of course, that is interest are being looked after by these multilateral bodies. Unfortunately, that is not being done. And unfortunately, I didn't hear that kind of conversation at the Munich conference. If it happened, it didn't happen in the, the open discussions. If at all it happened, it would be in private conversations. And that's not what we need at the moment. I think we need to advance a situation where there is representation across the board, and that would strengthen these multilateral bodies.
Along that line, let's also look at the perception of some of these multilateral bodies, for instance, NATO, and the quest by some countries now to join NATO, Finland and Sweden. How do you think the Ukraine situation positions NATO and then Finland and Sweden wanting to join NATO? How does that put Europe, the relationship between Europe and Russia and the rest part of the world, how does that place that relationship?
I mean, in simple terms, the current situation, Russia is arguing that it's taking its action as a strategic measure to increase its security. And Europe is also saying the same thing, that the Russian action is a threat to its continental security. And so we have a situation where the two sides are basing their actions on the argument that their security is being threatened. We also have a situation where the reality is Europe has never felt as vulnerable as it is at the moment. If you pick all the elements of national security, from energy security to physical security itself to cyber security, the development that precipitated the Russian invasion of Ukraine and that has sustained up to now have threatened all of these components of security that I've mentioned. The level of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda that exists at the moment, the volatility of the energy market at the moment, which of course we are all also victim of in Africa, and then food security that is also being threatened. All of that has not existed at the level that is existing at the moment as a result of that. So the question is any side benefiting from this? And the answer is no. If Finland and Norway want to join NATO, is to protect themselves and ensure that what happened to Ukraine does not happen to them. And at the moment, there is no guarantee that that would not happen because, like I said, all sides are not benefiting from this. And so I agree totally by the team of the Munich conference. It's a lose-lose situation, and there is a need for perhaps some compromise solution that would ensure sanity is restored in the current world order. At the moment, it's not helping anyone.
Now, talking about the global order, one of the keynote speakers at that conference was the UN Secretary General. He was also there to lend his own voice to the world order. And he made reference to the need for nations to be committed to the United Nations Charter, which according to him, if these agreements are being implemented, the world will be better for it. What much of significance will this agreement be to the effort to promote peace and unity globally?
Okay, I used to have a copy of that charter, and that's how much I believed in the charter as it were. And I think, if I remember well, it promotes equity, diversity, inclusion. It promotes the universal human rights and all of that. So yes, these are ideals that I think the world agreed to when the UN was formed. And unfortunately, at the moment, we're seeing significantly portions of that are being deserted or abandoned by certain components within the international community. Earlier on, I made reference to ongoing happenings in Ukraine following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's a sovereign country that another country is attempting to invade. I also made reference to developments in Gaza, where it appears to me that there is a collective punishment for the action of a rogue, association or political or whatever name you want to call them. And at the moment, the world is almost, tied down in its ability to prevent these two things from occurring. So if the UN Secretary General is reminding the world of the very reasons for which the UN was formed and is encouraging stronger alignment as well as involvement and implementation of that charter, then I think the timing is quite right. However, I'm worried by the fact that we're seeing across the world some elements of nationalism creeping up and strengthening. In Europe, you're seeing that the emergence of leaders who are promoting ideals that I think are completely against the UN Charter. In Africa, we're seeing military juntas that are taking up power, and of course that is to an extent as they continue. We're seeing the same thing in Niger Republic as an example. Of course, the situation in Gaza is totally against the UN Charter. So to that extent, I think the reminder is apt, but unfortunately, however, it's not likely that that call would be embraced by the very countries that he may have been speaking to when he made that call.
At the security conference, the growing influence of China as well as its increased military power was also discussed. Why do you think that was discussed there? Do you think that might be a challenge to the international order?
Yeah, so I mean, it's very obvious that the quote-unquote alternative spheres of influence that exist at the moment, if we're looking at the world order, would be to an extent China and Russia, that are, if you interpret what I've just said in another way, is they are direct threats to the Western influence. And again, I want to remind us that at the center of all of this is the competition for economic resources. China has, to a larger extent, proceeded ahead. It has its own challenges at the moment. However, it's made significant progress in advancing its economic interest around the world. And I know that the Europe and the US are uncomfortable about that. And so in conferences like this, that discussion is always taken about China and its role. But clearly, neither side can exist without the other. And so instead of an unhealthy competition, I think what would be beneficial to the world order is a competition that appreciates and respects each side, and that allows each side to pursue its interest as long as that interest does not in any way, put into threat the interest of the other side. This is not a conversation that would end now, the world order significantly is determined by the activities of these three or four major blocks, as it were. On the one hand, you have China, you've got Russia, you've got Europe, you've got the United States, and then the rest of us that are struggling to find our voices in this very convoluted structure. So yeah, I mean, this is expected that when gatherings like this are taking place, China would always be a subject of conversation.
Right. Let's make reference to the death of Alexei Navalny, which is also part of the highlights of the conference. In fact, the whole conference was thrown into confusion. Interestingly, the wife was there, who also took turn to talk about, you know, the need to seek justice. Now, looking at that sad news and the development in Russia, how much of setback would that bring to the effort being made by world leaders to promote security and peace globally? And then what should be the narrative with the present war going on in Russia and that of Israel with the alleged murder of some Palestinians, which is quite crucial to the issue of global security? I would like you to react to all these issues and what should be the line of actions to promote peace and unity globally.
So Navalny represented the voice of the opposition. He represented hope, as it were, for the opposition, and hope for a Russia that will one day present a different narrative than what it's currently presenting under Putin. Now, I do not have the statistics. I do not know what Russians, I mean those that living in Russia, those that have the capacity to vote, what their interests are. The narrative that is being put out is the narrative that the Western countries decide to put out. Now, was Navalny killed? If he was killed, what would be the consequence, for instance, for internal Russian politics? Those, for me, that's what is important. At the moment, we haven't had much in terms of local voices speaking up against the development from Russia. We've had his mom asking for his body to be given to her, and the mere thought that his son would die and that his body is even, withheld from his mother is enough to tell us that something is wrong in Russia. So yes, there are all of that, but I think it's absolutely important that we appreciate that there are always two sides to the story. And at the moment, what we're hearing more is the side that is being promoted by the Western side. I think it's perhaps the onus is on Russia to put out its own side of the story in a manner that would be transparent and acceptable. But having said that, one important thing that we can't run away from is the need for equity and justice. There's no country that would move forward if the voice of the opposition is suppressed, if the media is not allowed to operate freely, and if the universal suffrage, people are not allowed to exercise their rights in terms of who they want to vote. So if all of these indices do not exist in Russia, and that's what it appears like based on what we have at the moment. Again, I want to emphasize that we haven't really had much in terms of what Russians themselves are saying. And now, if all of these indices, like I've painted them, what are the case in Russia, then I think there is room for improvement in terms of advancing democracy, in terms of allowing Russians to exercise their universal suffrage, in terms of allowing the media to express itself, and more importantly, for the opposition to have a voice, so that at least there is some form of transparency in governance. Now, with regards to development in Israel and the Gaza war, without going into the politics of it, of the futile attempt of determining who is wrong or who is right, which I honestly don't even want to go into. The most important thing is human life. And if at the moment we are losing lives of children, if at the moment we're hearing that there is a strategic decision by the military to allow the killing of civilians in order to achieve an objective, then that is condemnable in all its ramifications. And I do hope that the world will speak as one to promote the sanctity of human life and to ensure that equity and justice is promoted on all sides. Life is life, whether it's an Israeli life or a Gazan life. And for me, that is what should be promoted. The same thing in Russia. And I think that is what we've lost as a people, as humanity. That idea that life, one life is more superior than that of the other. I didn't hear that coming out of the Munich conference. They were very guided in terms of what they put out there. And I think that's what, unfortunately, has allowed the situation to continue at the moment. We need to condemn acts that lead to the killing of civilian lives, whether that life is Israeli or that life is Gazan. At the end of the day, what matters is the sanctity of that life.
Okay, let's look at the issues concerning climate change and security, which was also an issue for discuss at the Munich Security Conference. So what are the potential conflict risks associated with climate change globally, the ways they can be mitigated?
No, definitely. The adaptation and the appreciation of the consequences of climate change, I think, is even what is more important. And then, of course, the next thing is to conduct a risk analysis to determine the capacity that each country has in implementing those mitigations for climate change. If you look at Africa, the general perception or belief is that we contribute very little to climate change, yet the consequence of that is heavier on us. Most of the conflict that is affecting Africa is rooted in climate change, yet we're seeing very little in terms of what our governments are doing to implement adaptive measures to reduce these consequences. And I think this is perhaps where the focus of the world needs to go to. On the one hand, effort to reduce our contributions as the world community to climate change, and then efforts at enhancing the capacity of especially the global South in implementing adaptive measures to reduce the consequences of climate change. Flood, as an example, perennially, the world experiences flood. Now, while the developed countries is able to implement adaptive measures to reduce the consequence of that, we're not seeing enough of that in the global South. The farmer-herder violence, the migration, movement of people, conflict over water, all of these are issues that would emerge. And sadly, in the global South, the discussions haven't even commenced. What more of even implementing measures to reduce these conflicts from arising? And so this is what worries me, especially as it affects the global South. When these conferences are held, because our voices are not there, these issues are rarely spoken about. And of course, we leave these conferences with very little in terms of expectation to develop this capacity that I've mentioned for implementing adaptive measures. And then, of course, for reducing the consequences of climate change. So sadly, it appears to me that climate change and its effect and consequences will continue to affect us as a people.
Let's look at Africa, away from the issues related to Russia and the rest of the world. Now, let's look at what is playing out in Sudan, for instance. There seems to be this global silence conspiracy against what is playing out in that nation. You're talking about the war, and this seems to be like another test for the international community. Give us a background to what is playing out in Sudan and what can be done to curtail the kind of crisis, going on in that region so that it will not snowball into another crisis for Africa.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. Earlier on, like I mentioned, African voice was almost completely silent at the Munich conference, security conference. And this is traditional over the period. The only time African voices are heard is when that voice would help or contribute to an achievement of a Western agenda, as it were. Now, the crisis in Sudan is rooted in a failed security sector reform, where an arm of the security sector has gone renegade It's been sponsored, as it were, by several countries, including some African countries, some Middle Eastern countries, and probably some Asian countries. And the consequence, unfortunately, is a significant portion of Sudanese have lost their lives.
Let's look at the UK's allocation of £300 million to improving security in Africa. Now, specifically, about £15 million of that sum was given to Nigeria to support security in Nigeria. In your assessment, because the project that this was targeted at was, one of them was for training of security personnel. Now, looking at the way things have been or current happenings, in your assessment, do you think that there are measurable improvements in terms of security in Nigeria?
So I think even the UK itself has admitted to the fact that its development aid in the area of security has not met the expectations, its expectations, as well as the expectations of Nigerians and Africans as a whole. Just to be clear on the record, there is a British military technical assistance team that has been embedded within the defense headquarters for, as far as I know, almost 20 years. It's domiciled right inside the defense headquarters, and that is the extent to which this bilateral cooperation between Nigeria and the UK has been. I don't think there's any other country that enjoys that. Even the Americans don't enjoy that. And what we have seen over time are elements of training in the area of military strategy, military tactics, and then military operations. We've also seen training in the area of intelligence gathering. But I think the general complaint that we hear from the Nigerian side is that these levels of trainings and support are limited. They are not usually extended in a manner that would allow the Nigerian side to appreciate and use them for the purposes of achieving our national strategic security imperatives. I think just 2 days ago, or just yesterday, the Chief of Defense Staff in an interview highlighted this point. Even though he was not specific to mentioning the UK or Britain, he spoke generally about the inability of our foreign partners to support us enough to achieve the imperatives of our national security strategy. And I think that has been the history too, in my understanding and assessment of our bilateral relationship with the UK. The strategic relationship is not one of mutual respect. It's one where, unfortunately, the intention is there, but then the objectives are usually not meant because of certain limitations within the clauses of the agreement that are arrived at or reached between the two sides.
Now let's beam a searchlight on the local issues here in Nigeria. Efforts are ongoing to see how state policing or state police can be legislated. It has passed, that bill has passed second reading, and some of the governors seems to be in alliance with the need to have state police. What are your concerns, and what should be of interest to the parties that are asking for state police or state police in Nigeria?
So yes, I don't think in the history of Nigeria there has been any period where there is a general consensus on the need for this decentralization of policing. At the moment, the presidency, the administration itself, if you pick the renewed hope agenda of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, the issue of decentralization and the creation of state police is embedded there. If you pick the Presidential Advisory Council report, it's also embedded there. And just recently, when the president met with the governors, one of the outcomes of that meeting is to look into the possibility of the creation of a state police. If you go to the National Assembly, like you indicated, a bill has passed second reading. But anyone who knows the process of the passing of a bill will know that there is still a very long way to go in terms of turning that bill into an act. And then if you now realize that perhaps depending on what the conceptual nature or the structure of the state policing system that is being considered. There are some that would require constitutional amendment. There are others that may not necessarily require constitutional amendment. So at this stage, we don't really know what the conceptualization is. If it's the type that would require constitutional amendment, then the distance to cover is even longer, because it would require this two-thirds of the state assemblies to also support that. And yes, consensus is there. I think the intention is there, but there's still a very long way to go before we realize it. Now, what are the likely pitfalls? Some of the pitfalls would include the absence of a strong democratic tenet at the state level. Part of the concern at the moment is that most state governors are like emperors. The level of democratic progress at the state levels are almost non-existent. The legislature is under the control of the state governors, and to an extent, the judiciary is under the control of the state governors. And so if you strengthen them further by providing this instrument of force, that's the police, to them, then it means this status that they enjoy as emperors would further be strengthened. So oppositions will be suffocated. Anyone who is critical of them is likely to be eliminated, and all of that. And I don't think as a country we want that. Another concern that is being met is the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion in most of our states. There are certain states that you go to, it will be very difficult for you to find even provisions within the constitution. Lagos stands out in this regard. You can stay in Lagos, reach a point where the constitution allows you, even as a non-quote-unquote indigene, you can run for a political position. But I don't think there's any other state in the country that does that. And so there is that fear that if state policing is allowed, only certain ethnic or religious groupings will be allowed to be recruited into that state policing, and then their actions would be completely against those that are not either of their religion or of their ethnicity that are living in those states. Those proponents or critics of this have used Zamfara state as an example. Part of the reason why we have the monster that we have at the moment in Zamfara is because of the vigilante that was created. That vigilante did not include elements of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Only one ethnic group, only one particular grouping were members of that grouping, and they started attacking the other group who were perceived to be the criminals. And so we have the monster that we have today in Zamfara state. So these are some of the pitfalls. Issues around funding the state police has also come up. The capacity of the states to pay for the police. Personally, I don't think that should be a challenge. I think we can actually address it. And then the others are also the capacity at the moment of the states in terms of their legislative and civil servants to manage something as delicate as the police. Again, these are things that I think would need to be addressed so that the pitfalls that were occurred between 1960 and 1966 or up to 67, when we had regional and I think local policing arrangements, can be avoided if we decide to go in this direction of state policing.
Talking about avoiding pitfalls, earlier you were talking about the collaboration between the UK and Nigeria towards ensuring security. You talked about Nigeria saying that the support from international partners is not enough. Now, what can ensure adequate collaboration in this regard? What are some areas to look at?
Okay, number one is for us to galvanize our interest. I was very happy when President Bola Ahmed Tinubu I think it was in June or July, he visited one of the military institutions in Kaduna, and he spoke about the need to harness our national powers. And I think that's the way to go. You can't go to a table to discuss with a partner when you've not harnessed your interest. We have numbers, we have the market, we also have the voice. If the entire African continent speaks as one, then it means there is a voice in multilateral forums. And I think that is what we're missing at the moment. As a country, we're not harnessing our national powers. Even officials argue among themselves over certain representations. At the moment, There are so many issues that have crept up that as a country, we've not come to unison in terms of what interests we would like to promote within the multilateral fora with regards to that. And so this is what worries me, and this is what annoys me. You cannot be engaged in multilateral conversations when you've not harmonized or improved your domestic policies. And I think improving those domestic policies, making sure that our voices are one, and making sure that we promote those voices is what is important. Our international partners come to us with their interest codified. They know what they want to attain. There is no free meal. I think it's absolutely important that we realize this. Anyone who's offering you a free meal has an interest behind. So what is your interest in engaging with that person? And how do you now push that interest? The best way is to strengthen our domestic policies, harmonize our interests, so that by the time we go for conversations, we're speaking with one voice. At the moment, we're not doing that.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.